morning. We are in week 7 of a 10-week series on the Gospel of Mark. We've called this series On Your Mark. And if you've missed any of the messages up to this point, you can catch up on our website if you want to go there and catch up. All of those messages are on there. Well, during this series, we want to encourage you to be reading through Mark because Mark is only 16 chapters long. We're going to be in chapters 9 and 10 today if you want to open up to there. But this gospel is an easier read because Mark, through the testimony of the Apostle Peter, tells about the life, ministry, teachings, healings, miracles, death, and resurrection of Jesus in a more fast-paced, action-packed way than some of the other Gospels. And that's why we call it the action gospel, because Mark moves from scene to scene rather rapidly, not giving as much detail as some of the other Gospels. But since this is the action gospel, we've been saying that we've been issuing an action challenge for each of the messages. And so if you were here last week, our challenge was for you to do this, for you to give something up this week that you think is keeping you from Jesus. And so whatever it is that's interfering with your relationship with God, we were saying get rid of it, remove it. And if that's something that needs to be a long-term thing, I would encourage you to keep giving it up. Well, last week we heard a very difficult message from Jesus in Mark chapter 8. Jesus began to reveal to his disciples that he had to suffer and be rejected and be put to death, and that he would rise 3 days later. And then to top off this kind of grim statement about his suffering and his death, Jesus then turned to the crowds, and he said this in Mark 8:34. He said, "Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves, take up their cross, and follow me." Jesus wanted potential followers to know the truth up front, that if you want to follow me, well, this is where we're headed towards hard times, suffering, and possibly even death. In other words, this is going to cost you something. He said, we kind of broke it down this way. If you're going to be my disciple, he broke it down this way. He said, you must deny yourself. We said that denying yourself involves a fundamental reorientation of your life. It's Jesus, not self, that is at the center of your life now. And then Jesus said that a disciple must take up your cross. So this is a picture of someone already condemned, required to carry the beam of their cross to their place of execution. Cross-bearing involves a willingness to suffer and die for the Lord's sake. Jesus is saying this is an all-in commitment here. And then Jesus said a disciple must follow him, follow Jesus. We talked about what it meant for someone in that culture who was a disciple of a rabbi to follow them, to be their disciple. And this phrase we talked about that many sages would say, they would say, may you be covered in the dust of your rabbi. But right after this tough teaching that Jesus gave, right after this challenge, we read this in Mark chapter 9, verse 1. Jesus said to them, "Truly I tell you, some who are standing here will not taste death before they see that the kingdom of God has come with power." And some took that to be like, okay, Jesus is going to return in their lifetime? That doesn't make sense because he didn't, right? Well, what Jesus was referring to is what some of his disciples were just about to witness. We're going to be looking at here. So as we move into chapters 9 and 10 of Mark today, we're going to see two very important yet two very distinct aspects of Jesus. And these things about Jesus would help spur his disciples to stay committed to Jesus. And so what we're going to see is we're going to see the glory of Jesus and we're going to see the humility of Jesus. So let's read from Mark chapter 9, starting in verse 2, as we look at the glory of Jesus. It says this: "After 6 days, Jesus took Peter, James, and John with him and led them up a high mountain where they were all alone. There, he transfigured before them." So what does that mean, that he transfigured before them? It means his appearance changed. And this is what it looked like. Verse 3, "His clothes became dazzling white, whiter than anyone in the world could bleach them. And there appeared before them Elijah and Moses, who were talking with Jesus." So 2 extra people end up showing up here, Moses and Elijah. And these aren't just any random people. Moses had died centuries earlier, and Elijah, he didn't die, he was taken directly up to heaven, but that happened centuries before this event that we're reading. So again, it's not just 2 random guys here that show up. And verse 5 says, "Peter said to Jesus, 'Rabbi, it is good for us to be here. Let us put up 3 shelters, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah.' It says he did not know what to say. They were so frightened. And I love this because Mark is writing down Peter's recollection. And so it's like Peter was recalling this event, and he's like, I can't believe I said what I said. I was just caught up in this amazing event, and I didn't know what to say. It was so stupid. Jesus, Elijah, and Moses are there, and I was so scared, but I wanted to sound so holy, and so I said, let's just put some shelters up for these three. And then it goes on, verse 7. Then a cloud appeared and covered them, and a voice came from the cloud, "This is my son whom I love. Listen to him." Suddenly, when they looked around, they no longer saw anyone with them except Jesus. And so this event is what we would call the transfiguration. And again, it refers to the change that was seen in Jesus. You see, the full glory of Jesus was cloaked in his time on this earth. But in this moment, his glory came bursting forth. With Christmas coming up already, it's hard to believe it's almost here in a month or so, but you might be singing some familiar Christmas carols, and one of them is "Hark the Herald Angels Sing." And there's this little line in it that says this. It says, "Veiled in flesh, the Godhead see, hail the incarnate deity." Veiled in flesh. Jesus' divinity was somewhat veiled with his flesh, by his flesh. But these three disciples, Peter, James, and John, they were given a rare glimpse of the full divinity and glory of Jesus. There would be no mistake about it from this point on. Now, only Peter, James, and John were able to witness this event. So with Jesus, there were the crowds that came around him and wanted to listen to him. And then there were the disciples, and disciple as far as the generic sense of people who followed Jesus. So you have the crowds, and you have the disciples, and then you have the apostles, the 12 apostles, right? But then there was like this inner circle of three, Peter, James, and John, who had an even more significant relationship with Jesus. We've said that the Gospel of Mark is about Jesus, obviously. It's clearly about Jesus. But a major storyline that runs through this Gospel is this journey of discovery that these disciples were on, this group of men who struggled to understand who Jesus really was. Well, these three privileged disciples were taken up on this high mountain, and they were given a fuller view of Jesus. It's like they were kind of like the leaders, and others would follow. Well, this transfiguration event, we can read about it here in Mark 9, but it's also recorded in Matthew 17. And Matthew tells us this. He says that there Jesus was transfigured before them, changed before them, and his face shone like the sun, and his clothes became as white as the light. And Mark says his clothes became dazzling white, whiter than anyone in the world could bleach them. You ever had something, you take something that's supposed to be white, like a white towel or like your teeth or something like that, and you put it up against something that is stark white, like a stark white piece of paper, and you're like, ew, that's not as white as I thought it was, right? It's kind of dingy. Well, here, Mark is describing Jesus' clothes, and Peter is telling him that they were a dazzling white, like whiter than when I take off my shirt white, like that white, right? If you can believe anything can be whiter than that. Whiter than anything seen before. And so for a short time, right there on that mountain, Peter, James, and John got to see Jesus like you and I and everyone else will one day see Jesus when he comes in his full power and glory. John would actually get a second glimpse of Jesus in his full glory when he saw a vision of him while he was exiled to the island of Patmos, while John was there in his later years of life. At that time, John said that when he saw Jesus, the scene was so impressive. He wrote this. He says, "When I saw him, I fell at his feet as though dead." But this first glimpse that he had here on this mountain was more than just a vision like it was in Revelation. Jesus was there in person and in all his radiance, in all his glory. And these men who got to see it were just completely overwhelmed. They were seeing a brightness that they had never seen before. And these witnesses to this event seemed to have a hard time putting into words what they were seeing. I mean, have you ever been somewhere and you saw something, like especially in nature, that was just so beautiful and so breathtaking, and maybe you took a picture of it, and every time you look at the pictures, you're just like, it just doesn't do it justice from what I got to see. What I saw was just beyond words, beyond images printed out. You just couldn't put words to the beauty you were seeing. Well, this was the disciples, these disciples. And then right before their eyes, not only was Jesus transfigured, changed before their eyes, but two other people appeared, as we said, Moses and Elijah. And they're just talking with Jesus, and these disciples were stunned. They didn't know what to say, but if someone was going to say something, it was Peter, right? So he pipes up and he says, "Teacher, this is good, isn't it? Let's just set up some teepees for everyone, and we're just going to bask in your glory, just you, me, James, John, and our new pals, Elijah and Moses." And he just wanted to stay there, right? But I get it. It's one of those moments you just want to stay in and never leave. But then this cloud appears. And if you know your Old Testament, when Moses was leading the Israelites out of Egypt, they followed a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire at night. And God was in the cloud. Well, here we see another cloud, and God was in this cloud too. This cloud surrounded them, and a voice came from the cloud, and it said, "This is my son whom I love. Listen to him." So it's very reminiscent of what was said at Jesus' baptism in Mark chapter 1. Well, at this moment, it was just a pivotal moment for Peter, James, and John. Notice what Mark said in verse 2 of this chapter. He said, there Jesus was transfigured before them, right before them. So I did student ministry for years, and I loved working with middle school and high school students. I still do. But with middle schoolers, they're just so funny because they change so much in those few years of middle school. I remember one time I was talking with a middle school student one Sunday morning, and he had this kind of high, squeaky voice, and he was like, "Hey, Steve, just wanted to tell you this," and then he coughed, and then all of a sudden he was talking like this, like just changed right before my eyes. It was like he went through puberty in 2 seconds, and it didn't go, it never went back up to here, right? It just stayed down. It was just amazing to see this change right before me. Well, this transfiguration of Jesus happened right in front of these disciples, and it happened for them. The purpose of the transfiguration was directed toward these three disciples. It says he transfigured before them, and the voice of God in the cloud was spoken to them. So Mark placed the transfiguration here right after some pretty tough news that Jesus had given his disciples. And it was kind of like confirmation of this difficult teaching that Jesus had just given his disciples about his suffering and his death, and this challenge that if they're going to be his disciple, they're going to have to deny themselves, take up their cross, and follow him. Only 6 days had passed since that startling disclosure that Jesus had made. And so it was like additional revelation of God's purpose in his Son was needed for them. And so to this select group of Jesus' disciples, this confirmation came in the form of the transfiguration, with God's booming voice out of the cloud. And this event, this happening would give them what they needed. It would motivate them. It would compel them. It would spur them on to follow Jesus no matter what. Have you ever had those moments in your life? You know, maybe they weren't as dramatic as this, but maybe you've had these moments where doubts begin to seep in, and trials seem to be getting very difficult for you, maybe too difficult for you to handle. Maybe you feel like God wants you to do something that you know is just beyond your ability. And so you start to wonder if God is there, if God even cares. And then something happens. And it's almost like it's a little message from heaven, it seems. And it gives you what you need to carry you through. I had a friend recently tell me that in Alcoholics Anonymous, they have this phrase. The phrase is it odd or is it God? Is it odd or is it God? And I love that. Maybe those seemingly odd moments in your life, those strange coincidences that happen in your life at just the right moments are these little ways of God revealing himself to you so that you can get through that moment, so you can get through that struggle, so you can get through the next day, so you can have the confidence to do what God is calling you to do. These disciples would never forget this mountaintop experience, and no doubt it would compel them on to sacrifice their own safety and their own welfare and to give their lives for Christ and for the sake of the gospel because they knew who Jesus really was. I mean, think about these three men. So we read that John was there. And John is the only one of the apostles after Judas died to not be martyred for his faith in Jesus Christ, to not be put to death because of his faith in Jesus Christ. Instead, though, he suffered a great deal under the persecution of Roman emperors, and he would eventually be banished to the island of Patmos, which was a destination for criminals and political prisoners. Then there was James, and so this is James, the brother of John, not James, the brother of Jesus, not the one who wrote the book James in our New Testament. So John's brother James, we read in Acts chapter 12 that this James was killed by Herod with the sword, and he was one of the first to lay down his life for Jesus. And then, of course, Peter was there. And church tradition tells us that Peter was crucified in Rome because of his faith. This happened around sometime in the mid-60s AD. But Peter didn't feel worthy to be put to death in the same way that Jesus was put to death. And so at his request, Peter requested to be crucified upside down. Both John and Peter would allude to this transfiguration event in their writings. In John's gospel, we read this. He said that the Word, meaning Jesus, became flesh and made his dwelling among us. And he said this, that we have seen his glory. Talking about this moment in Mark chapter 9. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. John literally saw the glory of the one and only Son who came from the Father. And then in Peter's second letter, he would write more extensively about this transfiguration. He said, "For we did not follow cleverly devised stories when we told you about the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ in power." He's saying, we're not making up this story, but we were eyewitnesses of his majesty. He said, we received honor and glory from God the Father when the voice came to him from the majestic glory saying, "This is my Son whom I love. With him I am well pleased." He said, we ourselves, we heard it. We heard it. We heard that voice that came from heaven when we were with him on that sacred mountain. And this is our motivation for believing and following Jesus too. It's not just because we want someone to give us a pain-free life, which Jesus never promised, by the way, anyway. Actually, quite the opposite. And it's not just so we can avoid hell. It's because we know who Jesus really is. You see, just wanting to avoid hell or wanting to live your best life now is not going to be enough for us to stay faithful through the trials of life and keep the faith. In just a few verses in Mark's gospel, and we'll get to this in the coming weeks, we turn the page and Jesus is entering into the city of Jerusalem. And this is where Jesus will suffer and he will die. So this type of comfortable Christianity that so many seem to be pursuing, so many think that this is what Jesus offers, this type of comfortable Christianity, it's not going to sustain you in places like Jerusalem. You see, we will follow and sing and pray and give and obey Jesus gladly, even in the face of suffering, to the extent that we have seen his glory. So on this sacred mountain, Jesus is seen with Moses and Elijah. You may remember that Moses made a very audacious request of God back in Exodus 33. In verse 18, Moses said to God, "Now show me your glory." And God said, "You want my glory? You can't handle my glory." That's not actually what he said, but here's what we read in his response. The Lord said, "Well, I will cause all my goodness to pass in front of you, and I will proclaim my name, the Lord, in your presence. I will have mercy on whom I will have mercy, and I will have compassion on whom I will have compassion." But, he said, "You can't handle my glory. You cannot see my face, for no one may see me and live." Then the Lord said, "There's a place near me where you may stand on a rock. When my glory passes by, I will put you in a cleft in the rock and cover you with my hand until I have passed by. Then I will remove my hand, and you will see my back, but my face must not be seen." Recently, I read this book called The Last Supper on the Moon by Levi Lusko, and it's a really great book. But in this book, Lusko described in detail the space suits that astronauts wore when they walked on the moon for that first time. And here's just a snippet of what he said. He said that each suit was personally custom tailored to the astronaut's body and was incredibly heavy, with a price tag of $100,000, which is more than $740,000 in today's dollars. Each one was made of 21 layers that provide protection against fire, cold, the vacuum of space, puncture, and abrasion. A vintage spacesuit on Earth, including the backpacks and the water-cooled underwear, not including the astronaut himself, comes in at 280 pounds. Isn't that crazy? Of course, in an environment where there's 1/6 gravity, it's not as heavy, but it's still bulky. And then later he writes this. He says that if your body is exposed to space, you will die instantly. You'll die instantly. And then he makes this correlation. He said it's a bit like what would happen if you or I, in our sinful state, were exposed to God's glory. Instant death. To handle space and God's glory, you must be hidden inside something that protects you. That's why NASA painstakingly builds suits. And that's why Jesus offers his righteousness for us to step into and be safe inside. Isn't that powerful imagery? And so Moses was unable to see the full glory of God because in his sinful state, God is just too holy to be exposed to. Moses and you and I, we would die in the presence of God's complete glory. So Moses was able to just see the back of the glory of God. And we read in the next chapter that when Moses finally came down from the mountain, that his face was radiant. Moses' face was radiant. Just from seeing the back of the glory of God, Moses' face shined. But something to take note of here. Up until this point, Moses had been experiencing a lot of frustration with the people that he was leading. Like they were a bunch of complainers and whiners, and they were unfaithful to God, and Moses was sort of at his wit's end with them. But at this moment, on top of this mountain with God, when he was able to see just the back of God's glory, it gave him a renewed passion and energy to finish the task that God had given him. Also kind of a neat little side note, Moses would never enter into the promised land because of the sin of the people that he was leading. That is until this moment that we read about here in the New Testament. On this mountain with Jesus, when he was transfigured, Moses would make it. Centuries later, he finally made it. But in Exodus, seeing the glory of God compelled Moses to press on. And then there was Elijah. Elijah was up there on the mountain with Jesus, Peter, James, John, and Moses. Elijah was the most dramatic and powerful of the prophets of the Old Testament era. By God's will and by God's power, he multiplied food, called down fire and rain, brought a young boy back to life, defied an evil queen, and defeated 400 prophets of Baal. And yet there was this time in Elijah's life where he was just at his lowest. When he was down and out, he was extremely lonely, and he needed to hear from God to get a taste of his glory. And he did. As I said earlier, Elijah didn't die. He was actually taken into heaven in a whirlwind. But when he was at his lowest moment, in 1 Kings 19, when he was down and out, it says this in verse 11, "The Lord said, 'Go out and stand on the mountain in the presence of the Lord, for the Lord is about to pass by.' Then a great and powerful wind tore the mountains apart and shattered the rocks before the Lord, but the Lord was not in the wind. After the wind, there was an earthquake, but the Lord was not in an earthquake. After the earthquake came a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire came a gentle whisper. When Elijah heard it, he pulled his cloak over his face and went out and stood at the mouth of the cave." God was in the whisper. And at that moment, experiencing the glory of God in just a whisper from him, it gave Elijah just what he needed to press on. Now, some of you might be thinking, well, that's great. And I'm sure if I had a direct revelation from God like these guys, then I could go the distance too. If I had the privilege of seeing the glory of Jesus, I could stay true. I could do great things for him too. But I don't have that. That happened then. That doesn't happen now. But then we read what Paul says in 2 Corinthians 4:6. He says, "For God, who said, 'Let light shine out of darkness,' made his light shine in our hearts to give us the light of the knowledge of God's glory displayed in the face of Christ." When God began his creation activity, he said, "Let there be light," and there was light. But in making us a new creation, those of us who have Christ in us, God has dispelled the darkness by illuminating our hearts to the knowledge of the glory of God. This isn't a one day we will have this thing. Paul is saying, you have this already. You have this already. And this is something that Moses and Elijah did not have. They didn't have the Holy Spirit living inside of them. And so nothing in life compares to knowing Christ. And the glory of Jesus then compels us. It spurs us on to totally follow him. So I spent a whole lot of time on the glory of Jesus here, but just briefly, I want to address a second aspect of Jesus that shows up, and that is the humility of Jesus. Even though Peter wanted to stay there up on this mountain in this incredible experience, Jesus, Peter, James, and John, they eventually came down from the mountaintop. And the glory was on the mountain, but we find humility when we come down from the mountain. Now, there are some sections of chapters 9 and 10 where we could discuss Jesus' humility showing up, like immediately when they came down from the mountain, Jesus healed this boy who had been possessed by an impure spirit. And this could have been a time where Jesus could have said, do you know who I am? Like, why are you bothering me? But in his humility, he healed this boy of some pretty strange and scary things that were happening to him. And we see that Jesus would go on to talk about becoming like children. He would speak about how to stay out of hell, how to stay married, how to prioritize your finances. And we read for a third time in these chapters that Jesus would once again predict his sufferings, his death, and his resurrection. But we don't have a lot of time to cover these things. So again, please be reading Mark on your own. Instead, though, I want to focus on a very presumptuous request that was made in Mark 10, verses 35 through 45. It says this, and starting in verse 35. Then James and John, the sons of Zebedee, came to him. These same James and John who were up on the mountaintop, right? Teacher, they said, we want you to do for us whatever we ask. What do you want me to do for you? He asked. They replied, let one of us sit at your right and the other at your left in your glory. You don't know what you're asking, Jesus said. Can you drink the cup I drink or be baptized with the baptism I am baptized with? We can, they answered. Jesus said to them, you will drink the cup I drink and be baptized with the baptism I am baptized with. That's a fun statement to read, by the way. But to sit at my right or my left is not for me to grant. These places belong to those for whom they have been prepared. When the 10 other apostles heard about this, they became indignant with James and John. And so I don't know if these other disciples were mad because they didn't think to ask this question first, or if they thought that this was just a very audacious ask of James and John. But here they are, James and John, just having this incredible mountaintop experience, and maybe they thought they were extra special because they had this experience. But this is also less than a week away from the crucifixion. And these two are trying to maneuver their way into positions of honor and power. John Stott said about this request, he said, the brother's statement that we want you to do whatever we ask must be the most selfish prayer ever prayed. They wanted to be on Jesus' right and left in glory, but there would be two others on his right and left before that. Stott was referring to the thieves who were on either side of Jesus when he was on the cross. Now, it might be easy for us to look at James and John and be like, man, they were such idiots, right? And give them a hard time for being so selfish. We think, man, what they did was just all about them, right? But I bet if we examined our prayer life, if we examined our life, there's a whole lot of self-interest in our prayers and in the way we live, isn't there? At some level, we're all more interested in me than you, right? That's just human nature. But it is not the nature of Jesus. And so let's read on. Verse 42. Jesus called them together and said, you know that those who are regarded as rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their high officials exercise authority over them. He said, not so with you guys. Instead, whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant, and whoever wants to be first must be slave of all. And then he says this about himself, for even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. So Jesus called out these religious leaders and how they would lord it over the people, how they would throw around their titles and authority. But Jesus was different. He didn't come to be served, although he had and has every right to be served. Instead, he came to serve. The one who had all authority in heaven and on earth, the one Paul described in this way in Philippians 2, who, being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage. Rather, he made himself nothing by taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness. And being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to death, even death on a cross. Jesus, the one deserving of all glory, the one who had all glory, left the glories of heaven, humbled himself, became a man, and gave his life as a ransom for us. There is nothing we could do, nothing we could say, nothing we could give, no act of greatness on our part that could cause us to ever deserve what he did for us. And this is the essence of true humility. Understanding the glory of Jesus and understanding our desperate need for him. Because we are captives to sin, and he paid our ransom. Without Jesus, we would be utterly lost. James and John may not have understood all of what Jesus was saying at first, but years later, John would write this. He would get it. He would say in 1 John 3:16, "This is how we know what love is. Jesus Christ laid down his life for us, and we ought to lay down our lives for our brothers and sisters." This recognition of Jesus' glory and his humility compelled John to live a life of humility and service to others and to Jesus. John remained faithful in following Jesus even through the trials and the persecutions. So the question is this for you all. The question is this for me. What will it take for you to humble yourself and follow Jesus? When we see even just a glimpse of the glory of Christ, it should provoke in us humility, knowing that the one who deserves our worship and our adoration, the one who has power and authority over all creation, is the one who gave his life for you and me. So here's our challenge for the week. I want to challenge you to do this. Do at least one act of self-sacrifice for someone else this week. Think of how you can give of yourself for the benefit of someone else. And do it at least once this week. But hopefully this begins to be a lifestyle of humility. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, we thank you for this event that Mark records for us of how Peter, James, and John were able to get a glimpse of the glory of Jesus. But I thank you that you've revealed yourself to us as well. Romans talks about how you have revealed your glory through what has been made, so that we're without excuse because we know from creation that there is a creator who has to be all powerful and all knowing. God, I pray even more intimately that we would know Jesus more and more, that we would truly understand who he is, the glory and power and authority that he has, and yet the humility that he had in coming to this earth, becoming man, becoming a servant to all, and obediently going to the cross to save my sins. Lord, I am so undeserving. So God, as I understand who Jesus is and what he did for me, I pray that it would provoke me to follow closer to Jesus, to give my complete life over to him. May we be spurred on towards love and good deeds, as your scripture says. May we be spurred on to obediently follow you because we love you, because we know you. It's in Jesus' name I pray. Amen. So this morning we want to just remind you that if there's a decision you need to make about Jesus and following him, whatever that decision is, a next step that you need to make, maybe it's a first step of getting into those waters and proclaiming Jesus Christ is over your life, dying to your old self, coming up a new creation. we're going to have some people in the fireside room who would love to talk with you just to your right. And so if you have a decision to make while we're singing, you can head on over there and talk with them, or just have them pray over you if that's what you need. But don't leave here with a decision hanging over your head and not doing something about it. Let's go ahead and stand and let's sing together.